Everyone. Thank you for joining us bright and early today. We're thrilled to offer this webinar. As many of you know, these webinar series began this summer to shine a light on some of the issues with respect to racial and ethnic disparities and COVID-19, and to bring together providers to think about creative solutions to some of those challenges. And so if you would like access to previous webinars, they are on the Maine CDC website. We will post that in the chat. You just have to scroll down to the Health Equity webinar series. But we are thrilled to continue today with a focus on vaccines, and I will let Lisa introduce our two speakers.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Liana. I did just put that link in the chat to the CDC website, as Liana mentioned, where these previous episodes are posted. You just have to scroll all the way down until you see the little PowerPoint image. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. As Liana said, this is the next in our ongoing series of webinars looking to promote health equity, and currently within the context of the COVID pandemic. I did also just want to say up front, in case folks have seen multiple invites out there, that we have continued to do this webinar monthly on the third Wednesday of every month on issues of health equity. Happens to be about COVID and now COVID vaccine, but we additionally have just recently launched a educational series or informational sessions specifically for clinicians about the COVID vaccine, and particularly now with the recently authorized Pfizer vaccine, that are being held for 30 minutes every Tuesday at 7:30 a.m. and every Friday at 12 noon. So folks are certainly also welcome to join those. Just a little later, I'll put the link there. But this one is specifically trying to focus on issues of equity. Last time we talked about vaccine hesitancy. We were thrilled today to have two additional speakers and panelists talking about the vaccine development again, and with a lens towards equity. So really want to tee up some of those issues as well. So with that, just let me introduce today's two presenters. First, we have Dr. Cathleen Fairfield, who's a physician scientist and associate professor of medicine. She's with Tufts University School of Medicine. She's got impressive background, college degree from Bowdoin, Boston University School of Medicine, intern and residency at Beth Israel in Boston, and then a master's and a doctorate in public health and epidemiology from the Harvard School of Public Health. Her research is at the intersection of health services research, healthcare delivery, and population health. She currently serves as the vice chair of the Department of Medicine at Maine Medical Center for Research and Quality Improvement, and has several other responsibilities, including seeing patients and supervising residents at the International Clinic at Maine Medical Center and the Portland Community Free Clinic. Kathleen is going to talk to us about the vaccine development and authorization process. And then we are very fortunate to have Elizabeth Neptune with us as well to share perspectives from her 30 years of experience in developing innovative health and human services within Native communities. She currently serves as the interim health director for Pleasant Point, and also serves as a member of the Passamaquoddy Tribal Council. She operates her own consulting business as well, and provides technical assistance to Native American tribes across the country. So some really great perspectives and experience. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Dr. Fairfield to start us off. And I'm going to share screen and show Dr. Fairfield's slides. Kathleen.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me. And I hope that you'll interrupt me if there are things that you want me to focus on a little bit more. This part of this conversation started with me reaching out to Lisa and Liana to talk about an opportunity. We have at Maine Health, we have been hoping to have the AstraZeneca vaccine trial. And we worked on it from June all the way up until about a week ago. And unfortunately couldn't get it started because of a bunch of logistical hurdles that resulted in delays. And then the efficacy data came out from Pfizer and Moderna, and then AstraZeneca. But it's a really important conversation to think about who's involved in these trials and how it might reflect the population that we feel are most vulnerable to COVID and at risk for being hesitant about getting the vaccine. So I'll just talk first of all about the federal approval process in general. I want to talk specifically about the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines and how they work, and then safety and efficacy. And I have a little data to show from Pfizer about who is in the trial. That is really reassuring, and then mechanisms of actions for some of the others in the pipeline. Next. Okay, thank you. So one of the concerns that people have had about the vaccine was, it became a little bit political because of some of the funding issues, but that it was, rushed. And really it was, all of the steps took place. It was just compressed. So on the top of this graphic is the traditional timeline, which is 10 to 15 years, starting from preclinical mouse studies, et cetera. Investigational new drug, early phase 1, where there might be only 100 people and they're trying to get the dose right and see if it's safe. Phase 2, phase 3 is where we really get at efficacy. And then we follow afterward to see how it works in populations and safety. And, there's a long process. In this case, they really compressed and overlapped these time windows, the phases. Phase 1 and phase 2 were done together, for example, and that was published late summer, September, and then the clinical trials were already enrolling for the these large 30 and 40,000 people in these clinical trials, which is pretty fantastic. And so, for example, with the emergency use authorization that happened recently, the FDA had already gone over to Belgium and inspected the factories where they were making the Pfizer vaccine. And I'm sure they've done the same thing for the Moderna vaccine, which they manufactured in Massachusetts. So that's pretty exciting. So just a quick piece about mRNA vaccines. People have been worried about this because it feels like gene therapy or introducing something into people's body. Both Pfizer and Moderna are mRNA vaccines. That's messenger RNA. It's synthetic, and the genome was published in January by Chinese scientists, and they shared it around the world. And so it allowed people to immediately start working on these platforms. And these companies actually already had been working on mRNA vaccine prototypes. So it wasn't brand new. They already had their platform set up, but they needed the genetics so they could start working on this. So it was targeted at the spike protein, which is how our bodies make antibodies in the natural state if we get an infection with COVID. So one of the things about this mRNA is that mRNA is unstable. Our body breaks it right down. So they have to wrap it in a lipid, a fatty layer, and then they have to actually store it at cold temperatures. In the case of the Pfizer one, ultra cold temperatures. When it gets into the body, our ribosomes in the cell will translate the protein. And then those proteins for the spike protein leave the cell, and our other cells, our B cells, you recognize those as foreign and start making the antibodies that are protective. And also our memory T cells pick that up and then hang around so that if we ever see the virus again, they remember how to make those antibodies. The protein, the mRNA is completely broken down. It can't back translate, it doesn't go into the nucleus, it can't back translate and get into our DNA. It can't. The only example of RNA vaccines are retroviral vaccines, viruses, retroviruses like HIV that get into our DNA. That's not an mRNA situation. So I think this science here is really fantastic, and there's a reason why people are nervous, but when you think about the science, the sequence is mRNA, proteins, and then the antibodies. So the clinical trials, phase 1 was spring and summer. It's 500 healthy volunteers. Phase 2 and 3 for that's Pfizer and BioNTech. That's how it's pronounced, I think. 2 doses of vaccine, 21 days apart. U.S. and 5 other countries. I just pasted the article that was published in New England Journal of Medicine on December 10th. Pfizer had filed for their emergency use authorization in late November, and then it was approved, as you all know, last Friday. This table just shows the demographics from the Pfizer vaccine. So the vaccine is called this BNT 162b2, and then they compared it, of course, with placebo. They had pretty equal numbers of men and women. I just want to call your attention to the racial and ethnic groups. They did have a high proportion of whites in the study. They had 9%, Lisa's got her cursor over there, thank you. 9% Black or African American, 4% Asian, only 0.5% Native American or Alaska Native, and so on. 2.4% multiracial, some not reported, and then 28% Latinx. So one of the things I was aware of from working on the AstraZeneca vaccine is that this has been a big priority for all these vaccines, is really recruiting from minority populations and making sure that people feel reassured that they were welcome to participate and that the vaccine succeeds in people that look like them. So you can also see, the countries involved, the age groups. They had people, the median age is 52, but they had people up into their early 90s, which was great. And they had a good proportion of people who were obese in the study. You can, So here's the money side. This is really exciting. So on the x-axis is time or days after dose 1, and on the y-axis is the cumulative incidence of COVID. The blue line is the placebo group, and the red line is the Pfizer vaccine group. And you can see that a little after right about 7 days, those curves start to diverge after the first dose, and stay apart. And in the little data on the bottom, vaccine efficacy, and then this 95% confidence intervals, you can see that after 7 days, the very bottom line where Lisa has her cursor, after 7 days after dose 2, they had 9 people in the vaccine group, and then 172 in the placebo group have disease, have COVID, and then that math turns out to be a vaccine efficacy of 94.8%, 95%, which is beyond our wildest dreams. The FDA said they would prove anything better than 50%. A lot of years our flu vaccine is 45, 50% effective. So this is wonderful news, even after the first dose. So I don't know why this says 8 and that New England Journal article said 9, but this came from the Washington Post. Yeah, so this was published in the Washington Post, and it was just kind of a nice graphic. They show all the all the people, and then this little tiny dot representing the 8 people sick with COVID, and then the 162 sick with COVID in the placebo group. And this is only a few months into this trial, so we'll continue to accrue cases. It's really very unfortunate that we're in the middle of this huge surge, but it's giving us an opportunity to see how these vaccines work in the world. One of the issues, for example, with some of the other vaccines that have been created against Ebola, for example, and Zika, are that the diseases got under control just as the vaccines were becoming available. So we can't figure out how they work, and nobody was anxious to spray COVID at people's faces and see how these vaccines work. There have not been any human challenge trials.
Can I just underscore that one, Kathleen, just because I think that's come up as a question when I've often talked to folks, is what you just said. This is not a vaccine challenge. It's not that people were exposed to. This was just people put out in the public, and then let's watch and see whether they get the disease. Is that a fair way to describe
really
it?
Important ethical point. There was discussion about, okay, well, thousands of people are dying in the world every day, but people really did not want to do that. And one of the main reasons for that is that we don't have any way to turn it off. We don't know who's going to get very, very ill from COVID. So until the better treatments evolved, it did not seem like a good idea to do that. This slide's also really important. This is another Washington Post graphic. These were adverse reactions after a second dose. Now there's something called grade 3 reactions, and those are kind of serious or bothersome enough that people can't, do their regular stuff. These are not grade 3. These are all adverse reactions. So 73% said, their arm hurt, which if you've ever gotten a flu vaccine, my arm always hurts. Sometimes I have to sleep on the other side. Tired, headache, mild muscle pain, some chills, some joint pain. 13% had fever, and 1% had vomiting. If you look at the numbers for people who had the grade 3 reactions, they're much, much smaller, and a couple of percent. But I don't want to sugarcoat this. Some people don't feel well after they get their second shot, which we hear, with Shingrix vaccine, for example, the shingles vaccine. That's actually, we think that's good because it means that people are actually having this, they call it reactogenicity. They're mounting an immune response. They're starting, they're activating all of their immune system. And that means your body's doing something. Moderna one expected to be reviewed this week. It's a newer company in Massachusetts. They did their phase 1/2 trial starting in March. So they immediately realized this was going to work. They started their phase 3 in July, 2 doses, 28 days apart. This was also placebo controlled. This was 30,000 volunteers. I'll just backtrack and say Pfizer started with 30,000 and then they got permission to go to 44,000 because they wanted to include older people, but they also want to include down to age 16 and now in fact they've included ages 12 to 15 as well for the kids. Moderna worked really hard at getting minority populations. And you can see this 37%. They haven't published the paper yet unless it happened in the last 24 hours. So that's really important. And they really did that by getting into cities and working with the population and also working with the clinical trialists and saying, this is what we're looking for because we want to make sure that everyone feels like this vaccine's for them. And we want to be able to show how it works in different populations. So they filed their emergency use authorization just at the end of November, and the FDA meets the 17th.
Tomorrow.
They also had great safety data. And I should have maybe included, in the New England Journal article, you can pull it down online. They specifically broke out the efficacy, how well it worked in the all of the subgroups, the minority groups, and it worked equally well. In fact, I think in the Black and African American subgroup, it was 100% effective, which is that's a little bit laughable, right? Because just that they didn't have any cases yet in the vaccine group, but that's really reassuring that there were no differences. Okay, so you've been hearing about this in the news, I'm sure, unless you have been hiding. 6.4 million doses, 12,000 expected from Maine by mid-December. So we just, everyone's getting their first doses. There were a lot of vaccines in arms already yesterday. That's pretty exciting. People are talking about, well, why didn't we buy more? Lots of finger pointing. I think, I will say it was a great investment in this whole process. And I think reassurance for all the manufacturers that they were going to get, they were getting supported and that if they made these vaccines, someone was going to buy them, which is good. The storage is a little bit difficult for the Pfizer one, so that's going to be a problem for getting it to remote locations, and that's an issue for us in Maine. The Moderna one, less so, where it can be stored at minus 20 degrees Celsius for up to 6 months, and then just stored in a refrigerator for up to 30 days, a regular medical refrigerator, and they can be at room temperature for up to 12 hours. And it doesn't have to be reconstituted. I was just looking this morning at some of the, how you have to reconstitute the Pfizer vaccine with saline and mix it up a little bit. And it's not that fancy. I don't think that's going to be a big issue. And then there's some vaccine information links here. So Lisa can send around these slides. And then the next slide, I think, is, so other vaccines in the pipeline. So viral vector vaccines are common, and this is an old technology. So AstraZeneca, the one that I was working on, was a viral vector vaccine, and then Johnson & Johnson, or the Janssen one, they're in phase 3. AstraZeneca released some results that they had inadvertently, this is from their UK trial, not their US trial. It inadvertently given the first 2,700 participants a half dose of on their first shot, and then the full dose of the vaccine, and it was like something like 5 trillion. I did have my kids help me with the exponents, how many zeros, 5 trillion viral, particles or something like that. And they use a chimpanzee adenovirus that can't replicate in people. The group that accidentally got the half dose first had better efficacy. It was 90% efficacy. And then the group that got full dose was 60% efficacy. So people were kind of puzzled by that. I heard Dr. Fauci talk about it. We don't know why. Maybe it's better to have a smaller first, they call it prime and boost. So the prime, being a little bit smaller, but really nobody knows. That group was also younger. It was less than 55. So people were, puzzling over a lot of these things. And there's discussions about a new trial with half dose and full dose for another 30,000 people. Or I also read in the lay press that they were talking to the Russian group about their Sputnik 5 vaccine and trying to do something together. I think what people are hopeful about the AstraZeneca vaccine is that it's only going to be a few dollars a dose, and that it'll be just regular refrigeration. So for the developing world, even in the group that the 60% efficacy, there were no severe COVID cases. And so that's really important, right? Even if you're getting COVID, some of these people will just have milder disease, and that's what we know from some of the influenza vaccines too. And then there are protein-based vaccines where they just take parts of the COVID virus and they purify the proteins, and people are using those. And no one that I know of is using a live attenuated vaccine. I don't think people are anxious or have been anxious to work with COVID, the virus itself, but that's possible in the future. I know that some of the Chinese vaccines that they've been using, they offer it. I think it's mandatory in their military. They've been using some killed vaccine where they irradiate the virus and they use that as the vaccinator. This graphic just shows how the CDC is thinking about how this is going to go, this vaccination program. So this is pretty exciting, really amazing moment in public health. So here we are in phase 1, where we know that we have some constraints. And it's interesting, we've been doing these information talks around Maine Health, as I know Lisa's starting to do statewide from the CDC. And in the beginning, people were really kind of resistant and concerned. And then it really kind of changed over the last couple of weeks. People sort of saying, well, when do we get it? We really want it. So it's pretty exciting. So phase 1A is people working in healthcare settings. And that really includes the whole team, right? You think about the custodial staff coming in to clean, and the people who feed patients, et cetera. So all of us, but the highest risk people are getting it right now, the ICU teams and the emergency department teams and the COVID teams. And then people in, this is an older slide actually, nursing home, long-term care facilities, patients and staff. And then other essential workers are expected to be next. Phase 2, large numbers of doses. We do think, the Moderna vaccine, if it gets approved, there'll be many millions of doses available starting later December. And this is all happening as we speak. So that's pretty exciting. And then we have lots of people to get through, right? Because there are all kinds of high risk patients, just older folks and others, and then all the essential workers. And then we still don't know about some populations. So I'll just briefly say, we don't know when we're gonna have to boost this vaccine. I think the clinical trials all go out 2 years, which is great, because we'll have a sense of when people's immunity starts to wane and when they might be at risk again. Most of the trials recruited people that were at risk, so healthcare workers and people who work in as civil servants and police and fire, etc. We also don't know, the vaccine trials excluded people who were pregnant and specifically did pregnancy tests before doses. So I was reviewing the ACOG guidance this morning. They actually said they don't want it withheld, the vaccine withheld from pregnant women. So it's kind of up to the pregnant women if they decide. They're not worried about the mRNA for the reasons I was talking about. It gets degraded. It's not going to back integrate into their DNA or into the fetus. But this, the frightening thing there, I think, is that we don't think it's good for pregnant women to have COVID. And we also don't know how the vaccine is going to work. So it's really a complete black box at this moment. And I would think that would be a difficult decision to make if I was expecting a baby. Let's see. I think there's one more slide, Lisa, and then there's some online tools too that people are kind of talking about, where you sort of can put in where you live and how soon you're going to get a vaccine. December January, I think these, the healthcare groups, and then the rest of the priority groups later in the winter. It's pretty exciting. The whole thing happened really fast. And I think so far so good in terms of setting this up. So we think we have about 80,000 frontline healthcare facility workers in Maine. It's a lot. 8,000 first responders, 12,000 in long-term care and assisted living. So that's 100,000 who are in the 1A group. So hopefully, soon. And then other priorities, people with comorbidities. We are an old state, of course. My little mother is 92, just turned 92. It's in Hollowell. Lots of adults. We worry about homeless. There's been a lot of talk about people who are incarcerated, very high risk. Other risk workers, teachers. Several friends who are teachers who are concerned, and everybody. Have sons still in public school. Everybody's really very concerned about all the kids out of school. I think it must be a particular concern of this group because we know that that this is disproportionately affected students of color, and that's all I have to say. Do we have a minute for questions, Lisa, or do you want to move on to Elizabeth and then do questions together?
Yes, sorry. I think what we're going to do is have Liz share her perspectives from what you said and from what she's hearing from the community, and then do questions together, if that would be okay.
Yeah, I'll mute myself.
We trust you. Liz.
Good morning, everyone. It was interesting. Thank you very much, Dr. Fairfield, for sharing your views on this vaccine. It is an incredibly important time, as you said, in public health. And in listening to your conversation and some of the conversations that I've had with some of our tribal citizens around the vaccine is always, how many, how can we trust this vaccine if it's coming from the government? That's one. It's usually a significant even challenge to get some of our folks to even consider taking the flu shot. I think with the pandemic, we've seen an uptick in people getting the flu shot, which makes me feel a little bit better. But they're still incredibly resistant with the thought of a COVID-19 vaccine. I think mostly because how quickly it came out, right? And so people don't understand that the RNA, I guess, process has been studied for over 20 years, but they don't understand that piece of it. I've heard everything from from tribal members whether or not is this going to something that's hurt us, right? So the government has given us stuff before, or they have tried to hurt us intentionally and didn't tell us until later. Things like that. I think a lot of that historic trauma has come into play. In looking at the articles, and I've been trying to read as many as possible, I know that people are not reporting major adverse effects, but what are those that do have adverse effects?
Sorry, is that a question back for Kathleen, Liz, you're saying? What are the major
No,
effects?
for the adverse effects after getting the vaccine. So you hear about you get some more adverse, you get a little bit of effects after 45 days, but what happens later? Like if there is an adverse reaction, a month down the road, what does that look like? And what can people expect at its worst? And I don't think we've heard much talked about that. I've heard it mentioned that most people don't have those adverse impacts, but what are adverse effects? But what happens to those that do? That would be, and out of those people, were any of those people Native American? I would want to know, what populations experienced some of those adverse effects, and really get to the point where we can really understand what might happen. I think people need to know what the possibilities are, even if they're minimal. if we're going to convince them to stand in line to get this vaccine. And in terms of the age ranges, and I saw your slide, that would be the other, what are the age ranges of people that do have those adverse effects, down the road, and what age of population tends to get them worse. And then the other thing that I thought, and I was thinking about this in advance last night, was it would be nice even to hear some testimonials for people that were in the trial of, what their honest experience was, with getting the vaccine. I still think it's going to be a stretch for us to get people to first. We have a small handful that are eager and waiting and asking every day, did we get any vaccine? Especially this week, since we've, everything's been shipped, the Pfizer was shipped. So we have a small handful of people that are eager to get their vaccine, and then, but we have more that aren't necessarily eager, and some of them are cautious that say, nope, I'm never getting it. And that worries me.
Great. So maybe we can open it up for discussion. I don't know, Kathleen, if you have thoughts to any of those observations from Liz. Thank you, Liz, for those.
Yeah.
And then would invite others as well. Feel free to unmute by mousing over the bottom left when you want to add something and or add comments or questions in the chat. But Kathleen, you want to respond to any of this?
Yeah, I'll just respond really quickly. I think it's great that people are asking these questions. One thing about vaccines is that the vast majority of adverse events happen in the first 6 weeks. And so that was one of the reasons why the FDA said we need at least half of the participants to be out 8 weeks in order for you to go for emergency use authorization. Obviously, and typically it would be 6 months. So this is emergency use authorization. These are not, fully approved yet, right? We're still in this window, but with even, 3,000 people dying a day in the US, we don't want to wait 6 more months. So we'll be following these. In the trial, people are still blinded, I think. There's a plan to unblind them, that both the participants and the investigators were unblinded. So people didn't actually know where they're getting the placebo or the active vaccine. There was a report in a testimonial in the New York Times, a woman who had a fever of 104 after her second dose, really felt bad. And I think we'll probably hear, some more of that as the public starts to get the vaccine. The protocol for the AstraZeneca vaccine, first of all, is 120 something pages long, but people had a diary, an e-diary they had to fill out every week about their symptoms, and they were really pushing people to report anything, which is great. There was an adverse event in the AstraZeneca trials, case of spinal cord inflammation, but there have been no serious adverse events in the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine trials, which is pretty fantastic. They will absolutely follow people for a long time. I also hope that people will be watching to see, as you're seeing all these, nurses and doctors and public health people, medical people saying, I trust that this process, it didn't have anything to do with the government, except, Moderna took some of the money because they were a tiny company. They needed it to hire staff, et cetera, to do their development. That's reassuring. Because, and then that's fine if you want to wait a couple months and watch how it goes for the healthcare workers and make sure that nothing bad happens. I think that's there are people who are cautious about a lot of things and would are not the early adopters and might want to see how it goes for everyone else before signing up.
Kathleen, can I jump in just on the Liz's question specifically about what bad could happen? I think it's fair to say one of the most feared reactions of immunizations in the past is Guillain-Barré syndrome, right?
Mm-hmm.
So an ascending paralysis, don't really know exactly why it's caused, but it has been observed after flu vaccine and others. at the frequency of about 1 in a million, I believe is about right.
Yeah.
And so even though the trial was, good sized, 44,000 people, that's not a million. So there are some serious side effects that one could see when one brings this to scale, and probably will see, right? It's different immunizing a million people from 44,000. So I think it's fair to talk about that. What else? There's been, after the infant rotavirus vaccine, there was intussusception, right? Also, I think 1 in a million or 1 in 2 million or something, where the intestine would double up on itself. And then was it dengue or yellow fever? There was something, right? I mean, so there can be serious reactions when this is brought to scale. And I think it's important to say that's not unexpected. So we shouldn't all, go into crisis when something happens, because it might at 1 in 2 million, which could happen over the next couple of weeks, even, right, as this gets distributed. So that is just sort of, part of the process. It's not untoward, but the risk, it's not a zero-sum risk, right? It's 1 in a million risk versus your risk of dying if you're in a certain subgroup, if you're over 65, if your BMI is over 30, if you have chronic conditions, right? So I think we have to have those balanced conversations as providers and community members. So, and I think we almost could inadvertently shoot ourselves in the foot by talking about how safe this vaccine is, because something bad will happen. Something bad will happen. It's unquestionable. That's what happens when you bring, new interventions to large scale population, implementation. So, and I don't know, Kathleen, if you have thoughts about other vaccine serious effects that have been seen with others in the past.
Yeah, I think you pointed out the big ones. The yellow fever vaccine is a live virus vaccine, so we don't give that. We give it in our travel clinic. We don't give that to people who have immunosuppression. We start getting more worried as they get over 65, or if they have uncontrolled HIV, for example. But this is not a live virus vaccine.
It's not a live virus.
This can't give you COVID. And so we actually feel, more confident there. And I agree. I think some things are going to happen, and then it becomes a trade-off. And there are people who say, maybe they're, young and perfectly well, and they say, I'll take my chances with the virus. And that's an interesting problem. So my son was doing this persuasive essay yesterday about, kind of why it should be mandatory. This is not going to be mandatory, but I know there's a lot of talk in the news about, like, maybe later it will be mandatory. For now, this is absolutely not mandatory. But it's an interesting problem because, when we can't get to herd immunity until a certain proportion of the public gets immune, either from natural infection or from having the vaccine. We don't know what that is for COVID. Is it 70%? Is it 90%? But people, me getting vaccinated, that might protect, people around me too. So I think people think of it as an individual choice, but it's really not. It's
well, and I think that there is literature from some of diverse communities that the argument that this protects your community is a stronger one even than this protects you. So I think we're going to be talking more in subsequent of these sessions about the conversation, what works to have the conversation with people. I do see a question from Lisa Tappert. What's the very simple way to explain the vaccine cannot give someone COVID? I think it says, Dr. Fairfield just said, there is no virus as part of this vaccine. The virus is not injected. And that's the other serious adverse event I just remember is polio, right? So in the early days of polio, which was an attenuated live virus, there were some very rare, it was like 1 in 2 million or something, cases of polio, but this is not the virus. There is no virus in the vaccine. Is that a fair way to say it, Kathleen?
Yeah, definitely.
Other thoughts? What are you all hearing in your communities? What's your plan for conversations? Lisa, I was afraid I was going to have to call on you, but I hear you going for the unmute. So
I think the question I have actually, and thank you so much to both of you for your presentations. The prioritization lists that I see the people who present them continue to talk about racial and ethnic minorities, but the prioritization lists I see don't list New Mainers, African Americans, farm workers in the prioritization. Is that because we haven't gotten there yet? Because I'm concerned that the vaccine hesitancy in those groups really means that we need to bump those folks up earlier so that we can do everything we can as early as possible, because it's going to take time, as Elizabeth said.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I sat in on some of the, on like the ACIP, which is the committee, the subcommittee that of the CDC that made, makes recommendations. The first priority is to prevent loss of life and to prevent our healthcare system from getting overwhelmed, which will then prevent loss of life. So that's why, we've got to keep the healthcare workers. First of all, it's been kind of scary going to the hospital since March, and to the healthcare workers, and I'm not even in a COVID unit, but I work with residents who work in the COVID units. We need to keep the healthcare workers well first, and then the long-term care facility folks, they're the ones that have 60% death rate from COVID. So the workers are, obviously a lot of them have multiple jobs, and that's part of how it gets into the facilities. But also when the patients get sick, right, they go to the hospital and then they're in the ER, and so the ER staff, and then they go to the wards and the ward staff and everybody around them. So that was the first priority. I think I did see nationally, actually quite a few communities of color, there's high representation in healthcare fields, including, people who work at long-term care facilities. And I know in Portland, people who work at both long-term care, direct caregivers, support providers, and interpreters. So those groups should all be candidates pretty soon, the next few weeks. And then I think we do need to start thinking about, yes, this whole kind of the essential worker group. People have talked about, groups within the groups, right? So like even in the healthcare setting, I'm not in line quite yet because I'm an outpatient doc, but for the other high risk groups, trying and realizing, it's going to get to everybody sooner or later, but trying to be most rational about who's at risk of exposure and who's at risk of not doing well. Those are the issues. And then I think that with incarcerated, that's one of the issues, is they're so at high risk of exposure, and their health is often not good as well because of diabetes, other comorbidities.
And I don't know, Liana, if you want to say anything more from the state perspective and the efforts around ensuring equitable distribution.
Sure. So a couple of things. Number one is that the tiers that were put forth by the state largely have followed the ACIP recommendations, but that it was an interim plan. Freezing up a little bit. Sorry. My connection's a little bit weak, so I apologize if I freeze up a little. I'm going to turn off my video and see if that helps for a moment. As I said, there are ongoing conversations both within the CDC and the governor's office ultimately. As we learn more, those conversations will continue. As a department, we're doing a couple of things to think about those, how to have those conversations and make those decisions. One is actually today, Dr. Shaw will join the Permanent Commission on the status of, I'm going to totally mess this up, it's a really long title, but on the status of racial, indigenous, and tribal Maine populations, I believe is the full title. And really a large part of that conversation will center on how the tiers were established and how different communities are considered within that. There is a larger philosophy, I think, that ACIP has articulated, which is, an understanding that there have been disparate impacts along the lines of race and ethnicity, and that's absolutely a result of structural and systemic racism, not necessarily of race itself. And so the tiers are really designed around where those structures and how those structures manifest, right? So the likelihood of living in congregate living scenarios, the likelihood of being in healthcare or connected to a healthcare or essential worker. And so it's not, I think there's a philosophy ethnic minority groups should be named as a specific tier, or whether this approach of thinking about what structural causes for inequity and how those are named in the tiers. And that is an ongoing conversation and one that we are very much willing to engage in and have begun to engage in with the Permanent Commission already. In addition, and some of you on the call already know this, I'm pulling together a work group that will focus on really how we ensure equitable uptake and distribution of the vaccine. And so that will be a combination of folks internally and externally considering what different communities' reasons for hesitancy might be and what types of education and outreach and community partnerships might best help us to overcome that hesitancy, or at least to provide people with the right information transparently and in a timely manner that they can make.
Ruh-roh.
This time I muted on purpose. Still.
So timely, so they can make, you said, we lost that.
Okay, it did get cut off. I said that we at least provide timely information and transparent information around some of the questions that you all presented today in order for folks to make the best decisions for themselves on the timeline that is right for them in consultation with their healthcare provider.
I think it's also fair, Liana, to say that, to the extent that people from diverse communities in the state either, are somewhere in those top tier, and it's 1A, again, healthcare providers, which is defined very broadly. We've had to sub-prioritize with those first 12,000 doses to very frontline people taking care of COVID patients, but broadly the category healthcare providers, anyone who is in a setting where patients are basically with direct contact. And then 1B critical infrastructure and 1C long-term care. Long-term care is 1A, 1C is over 65 and chronic conditions that many people from diverse communities would fall into those. So an important part of the conversation in communities, I would think, is how do you access it if you are one of those, or making sure you're talking to your employer if you're in any kind of healthcare setting, whether you're a provider or not. As Dr. Fairfield said a minute ago, the housekeeping staff is also in that group. Or if you're critical infrastructure, that's a real question right now at the state even, is how do we organize vaccination to those folks? There's no master system that says everybody who is a taxi driver come today for a vaccine. There isn't that yet. So that is likely to go through people's healthcare providers and or some new maybe public or mass vaccination events that are still yet to be set up. So encouraging people, if they want it and when they want it, when they fall into one of those groups, the easiest thing is to talk, the probably most practical thing is to talk to their healthcare provider about when are we going to be able to get access and how would we do that if they are interested in getting it. But it is going to be a lot of logistical challenges still, even within those categories, even within those prioritized categories. Other thoughts, concerns, suggestions for how we can, as a state, through our efforts, help to ensure equitable vaccine distribution and uptake. And we really tried to emphasize the uptake part, right? The vaccines don't save lives, vaccinations to save lives. So what kind of communications, conversations? I liked your suggestion, Liz, to get testimonials from people that have been in the trials or even been early recipients of the vaccine here in Maine, right? Visible community leaders, pictures of people getting shots in arms, testimonials from respected sources in the community. I'm seeing another question here in the chat. I've heard conversations stating the vaccine was made so quickly for distribution. We don't know how it will affect people with certain medical conditions or what kinds of side effects could happen with current prescriptions. I don't know if you mean like with people on certain medications, also injection reactions or concern. How can we have conversations about this with people to put their minds at ease? Kathleen, you want to jump into that?
Yeah, sure. Well, it was a big point of all the and it has been a big point of all the vaccine trials to make sure that they wanted to pick people who are at risk of being exposed to the virus, right, in their jobs or or volunteer activities, whatever they do. But they also wanted to pick a representative population. So there were people with diabetes and hypertension and obesity and the aged, et cetera. And so, and those people were on all kinds of medications, so diabetes medicines and hypertension medicines and et cetera. There were even Pfizer vaccine includes people with HIV. They've really paid attention to the fact that they wanted the people in the trials to look like the population, again, with the exception of pregnancy, because I think that's just such a probably legal risk issue for clinical trials. And so I think you really can reassure them that the people involved in these big clinical trials were the public. They weren't not looking for young, healthy, college kids who go out, at risk because they go to parties. They were looking for people who were at risk for being exposed because they of their jobs, et cetera. And then the injection reactions, we saw that from that Wall Street Journal article. And then the severe reactions is just really, that are going to limit people from working, or just a couple of percent. One of the things we've been talking about at Maine Health is how is that going to impact people's ability to work? Because, for example, we have to fill out a symptom screener every day that we go to the hospital. And so if you're having a fever from the vaccine, what do you do about that? How do you know they didn't just get COVID? And so we're trying to stagger vaccine among different groups. We don't want, all of the ICU nurses to get vaccinated on the same day, for example. And I think we're gonna learn more as this goes on about how, kind of in real life, how much time people end up having to be out of work, hopefully a day or two, no more than a day or two, if they have even that kind of reaction.
I think another thing that I've heard folks say is to remind folks that those, and it's hard to even call them side effects, it's almost predictable, right? Reactogenicity. It's the evidence that the body is reacting to the vaccine to create the immune response. So instead of, overly being concerned that it got soreness, and again, it's the typical thing, soreness, muscle aches, but maybe body aches, low-grade fever, fatigue, that's your body doing it. That's your body doing what it's supposed to do, but not also dismissing like dry cough, shortness of breath, loss of taste or smell. Those are not side effects. Those could be COVID symptoms. And I think it's also important to recognize that because of the prevalence of COVID in the community, it is entirely possible that somebody could have early COVID or asymptomatic COVID at the time or just before they get the vaccine, and then they do develop COVID. That is not the vaccine giving them COVID. That is, they probably just had it and didn't know it because it is prevalent, and we don't always know it early in the disease. So again, the vaccine does not contain virus. It cannot cause COVID, I think is a really important message to get out there. There.
Lisa, one of the other questions that I've heard from folks, and that sort of goes in line with this black box around pregnancy and the clinical trials, is children. And what is the timeline for children? What do we know thus far about COVID vaccines in children?
Yeah, great question. So Pfizer, as I said, they first included children down to 16, and the emergency use authorization includes 16 and over. And then they went further and did the 12 to 15-year-olds, and so they're not included under the emergency use authorization yet. We'll probably have enough data. I assume Pfizer will have enough data in the next couple weeks for them to be added. I think that's going to be especially important for children that have comorbidities. I think some of the others, they do fine, right? But we know they don't all do fine. And then Linda is asking, if you had COVID, do you still need the vaccine? So what they're actually saying, there were about 10% of the trial participants in the Pfizer trial actually had COVID antibodies. So I know, for the AstraZeneca protocol, they get their blood drawn at the day of the first shot, so that they didn't actually know that they had an asymptomatic case of COVID, for example. And they did fine. There were no reactions. So it's not a contraindication to getting the vaccine. What they're saying is that if you've had it, especially if you've had it in the last 90 days, don't get the vaccine right now because we don't have enough for everybody else. So please wait. And we don't know how long natural immunity lasts if you had COVID. We think, so the CDC is saying at least 90 days. It's probably longer. And, but then after that, we'll probably have people who had COVID will be invited to get the vaccine too. And what is the age for Moderna's EUA? So they're meeting on the 17th. I don't think that the Moderna protocol included children. So I can't answer that, but I'm assuming that it's going to be 18 and over.
Okay. Well, with that, we are pretty close to the end of the hour here, so we should probably plan to wrap up. I just wanted to thank you all again for joining, and thanks so much, Liz and Kathleen, for joining us today and sharing this information. We have recorded the webinar as mentioned, and I'm just going to chat again the link where this will be posted, and the previous health equity webinars are posted. You just have to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page. We are planning to continue this series monthly for now, and we're thinking that a good topic for the January, what would be January 20th, it's always the third Wednesday of the month, would be preparing for conversations with communities and patients about the COVID vaccine, recognizing that at that point, a month from now, we'll be much closer to wider distribution of the vaccine in communities. So if any of you have thoughts for wanting to participate around that, or suggestions for speakers, let us know. But otherwise, thank you for joining. Liana, anything else from you in closing? Good. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone. Thanks for your work out in the communities, for having these conversations, for being a part of this one, and stay safe. Thank you so much.